Welcome to Whistle Stops, a new program series from the Truman Library Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our next trip down the tracks. I'm Cassie Pikarsky, Director of Strategic Initiatives and host for our journey through the all-new permanent exhibition at the Truman Presidential Library and Museum after a spectacular $29 million renovation. At every stop along the route, the series will provide you with special access to all the fascinating galleries, artifacts, films, and stories inside. Now, before I give the all aboard, I'd like to give a quick thank you to our generous Whistle Stop series sponsor, Black & Veatch. Today, we're going to travel to Missouri at the turn of the century to explore Harry S. Truman's formative years. Now, after watching Truman's abrupt ascension to the presidency in the museum's introduction film, which was brilliantly detailed in the first episode in our Whistle Stop series by A.J. Bain, available for viewing on the Truman Library Institute website if you missed it, we'll stop in the next gallery, Plow to Politics, to explore the origins of the 33rd president and discover the very first thing, or things, in Truman's past that prepared him for the presidency. The artifacts, documents, and hands-on interactives in the first room of Plow to Politics gallery will guide you through the construction of the strong foundation that Truman laid on to succeed in the presidency. His Midwestern background, his strong values, diverse life experiences, and close personal relationships. This includes the Lasting Impressions Wall, where you can further explore the things that left a lasting impression on Truman. Now, for today's journey, we have a very special conductor. It's me. In addition to hosting Whistle Stops and leading strategic projects for the Truman Library Institute, I was project lead for the nationally recognized renovation of the Truman Library and permanent exhibition, and I am honored to be your conductor today. So I'll take your tickets and we'll get this locomotive rolling. Although Truman was the last of 9 US presidents to not have a college degree and the only one in the 20th century, he was far from uneducated. At an early age, Truman was an avid reader and would be throughout the rest of his life, from the Bible and history to fiction and poetry. David McCullough once said, Truman himself was a great student of history, which is extremely important to understand if one wants to understand him. In the gallery's many photos of young Truman, you'll see his infamous thick glasses, like this one of him at age 13. As a child, Truman's poor eyesight limited his ability to play sports or enjoy many outdoor activities. Instead, Truman filled his time with reading and playing the piano. In the galleries, when you walk by the piano, it will play several of the pieces that Truman enjoyed playing. This is one of them by Paderewski. But Truman's playing is a whole story, piano playing is a whole story by itself, so we will leave that for another day. At this stop, we're going to focus on the reading. This is a photograph of Truman with his brother Vivian. Truman is about 4 years old in this picture, and Vivian is 2. Many years later, in 1894, they would both catch diphtheria. Before there was a vaccine, diphtheria was a serious bacterial infection that could be deadly, especially in children. Truman was temporarily paralyzed in the arms and legs. Remembering this period, his sister said that that's when Truman started reading so much. He couldn't do anything else, and he couldn't get up without help, so he'd lie on the floor and put the books down on the floor in front of him, and he would read that way. For his 10th birthday, his mother gave him a 4-volume set of Charles F. Horne's Great Men and Famous Women, a series of pen and pencil sketches of the lives of more than 200 of the most prominent people in history. The 4 volumes were soldiers and sailors, statesmen and sages, workmen and heroes, and artists and authors. Now, the set of books on view in the exhibit are not the original ones that Truman read. Those have been lost to time, but they are from the same period. Truman would later recount the receipt of these books, his favorite of which was Statesmen and Sages, as one of the turning points in his life. Now, not to be outdone by his wife, Truman's father, John, gifted him Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans. Between the 2 books, Truman gathered a list of heroes that he strove to emulate. characteristics he held dear, and lessons that he would carry with him to the presidency. A few of these heroes and their influences are detailed in the gallery. Today, we'll look in depth at not only some of what Truman read and what he took away from it, but how he put it to use as president. But first, we should finish exploring Truman's literary bookshelf, because biographies of notable individuals were far from the only books that Truman read. Mary Ellen and John Truman wanted a house full of books for their family, attempting to fill the Grandview farm, seen here, with as many books as they could. John gathered loose change, saving up for the complete set of William Shakespeare, which Truman quickly consumed. Truman also read poetry, enjoying the poems and songs of Robert Burns and Alfred Lloyd Tennyson's poem, Locksley Hall. He first copied it in longhand as a high school senior and carried a copy in his wallet for the rest of his life. Published in 1842, the poem captured Truman's idealism and vision of a peaceful world. I'm going to read a stanza of it for you here now. Till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled, in the parliament of man, the federation of the world. There the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. Now, a schoolmate remembers seeing Truman take 2 or 3 books home every weekend, saying, I guess by Monday he read them all, which just might have been the case. Truman claimed to have read the Bible twice by age 12. By age 14, he said that he had read every volume, at least 2,000 books, 3,000 to 4,000 by some estimations, in the Independence Library, which is seen here. In his later years, in 1962, Truman wrote to his friend and former Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, about it. And you can see what he wrote on the right-hand side, which I will read for you now. He said, believe it or not, I read them all, including the Acyclos. Maybe I was a damn fool, but it served me well when my terrible trial came. Not surprisingly, Truman's classmates, seen here in their senior class photo, and Truman is in the very back row, the 4th from the left. Truman's classmates consulted him when they had questions about history or religion. In a 1960s oral history archived at the Truman Library, one of Truman's classmates, Henry Childs, called Truman a great historian, as he remembered a particular instance in which Truman helped straighten out the boys during a lively conversation about the Dalton Gang. The Dalton Gang was a group of outlaws that robbed banks in Oklahoma and Kansas between 1890 and 1892. The boys were debating which brother had started the group and how many were killed in the attempted double bank robbery in Coffeyville, Kansas, that was the gang's demise. Of course, Truman had the answers. Henry recalled they wanted to call him a sissy, but they didn't do it because they had a lot of respect for him. Now, the boys might not have called him a sissy, but later in life, Truman would call himself a sissy when he recalled those years. Looking back, Truman said, reading history to me was far more than a romantic adventure. It was solid instruction and wise teaching, which I somehow felt I wanted and needed. I could see that history had some extremely valuable lessons to teach. I learned from it that a leader is a man who has the ability to get other people to do what they don't want to do and like it. 2 of Truman's high school composition books are in the collection of the Truman Library. The writings inside focus on people and moral ideals that Truman gathered from his readings. And from them, we can conclude the following about Truman's beliefs. Courage counted above all. Patriotism was important. Shame was detestable. On courage, Truman wrote, the virtue I call courage is not in always facing the foe, but in taking care of those at home. A true heart, a strong mind, and a great deal of courage, and I think a man will get through the world. After World War II, courage and a strong mind got Truman through his stewardship of a post-war democratic order, but that's a few gallery stops down the tracks. After reading The Merchant of Venice, which can be seen here in the center, Truman wrote about what he believed was the ideal man. He should be, in the first place, brave. Then he should fear his God. He must not be cold, haughty, or hypocritical, but he must have a warm heart and love someone. Now, with all this reading, Truman was probably an excellent student, right? Not exactly. We only have Truman's second grade report card on view in the exhibit and seen here. None of his high school report cards survived a fire at the school. But based on oral histories with his teachers, we know that Truman was a good student, but not an exceptional one, especially next to his friend and future press secretary, Charlie Ross, who Latin and mathematics teacher, Miss W.L.C. Palmer, called brilliant. Nonetheless, it was clear that Truman had a special something. In later years, Miss Palmer admitted, although perhaps her memory had changed with the benefit of time, I knew Harry would amount to something, but I never thought he would be president and Bess the first lady. After high school, Truman had ambitions to study law and finance, but it was his family's finances and Truman's duty to his family that led him through numerous careers. First in the Kansas City mailroom, timekeeping for the railroad, and lastly, working in banks in downtown Kansas City, including for Commerce Bank, where we have his employment application and one of his reviews. Spoiler alert, he was a good employee before being called back to the family farm. Now, we know from his correspondence during this time and his diaries that he continued to read, including some Latin, just for fun. If you're familiar with the Truman story, he next leaves the family farm to serve, previews there. He next leaves the family farm to serve in World War I. As a little teaser for our next whistle stop, during World War I, Truman impressed his unit with his knowledge of French history. While in the city of Orleans, he insisted that they visit the city's cathedral and a bronze statue of Joan of Arc. Now, the history lessons that Truman learned in the books he read are evident in his 30 years of public service. Reading provided Truman ethical and moral guidance. He used it as a tool to make decisions, looking to the past whenever an issue arose. Truman, seen here with Bess on the Truman balcony after the renovation of the White House, looked to history for insight into civil rights, the recognition of Israel, fighting communism, post-war policy, and even whether or not he should run for another term. Now, Truman didn't only use history. Of course, he surrounded himself with top advisors and experts before making a decision. But the lessons he had taken away from his favorite books as a young boy were never far from his mind. As presiding judge of Jackson County, Truman wrote in an autobiographical manuscript, which he entitled The Military Career of a Missourian, that in reading the lives of great men, I found that the first victory they won was over themselves and their carnal urges. Self-discipline with all of them came first. You'll probably notice that he is referring to from great men and famous women where he found men to emulate. The Roman general Cincinnatus, the general Hannibal, the Persian leader Cyrus the Great, and George Washington, among others. Now, Hannibal was a general and military strategist who later went into politics. He was admired for his ability to judge individual strengths and weaknesses, doing so, in fact, with only one eye. Truman would reflect that there is not in all history so wonderful an example of what a single man of genius may achieve against tremendous odds. Now, remember Cyrus, Cincinnatus, and Washington, because we'll get back to them in a little bit. In the Senate, Truman knew that his formal education did not match that of his fellow senators, and he worked hard to compensate for it. Assigned to a new interstate commerce subcommittee charged with investigating railroad finances, Truman gathered more than 50 volumes of railroad management, history, and more from the Library of Congress. In later years, he would remark how surprised and disappointed he was with how few of his congressmen ever utilized the library. The White House staff quickly came to admire Truman's grasp of history. Sitting in the Oval Office, Truman said, "If a man is acquainted with what other people have experienced at this desk, it will be easier for him to go through a similar experience. It is ignorance that causes most mistakes. The man who sits here ought to know his American history at least." The staff saw Truman's wealth of knowledge as one of his greatest strengths. When Truman said he would have liked to have been a history teacher, White House counsel Clark Clifford asked him, "Rather teach it than make it?" Truman responded, "Yes, I think so. It would be not nearly so much trouble." From his years of reading, Truman was also aware of the threats posed by demagogues and bigotry. Among these, he included the Ku Klux Klan. Despite his inclinations as a Missourian and descendant of Confederates, Truman knew that as president, he could not sit idly by any longer and do nothing in the face of the glaring injustices occurring in the South. In a response to a friend from home who advised him to take it easy on civil rights, Truman responded, "The main difficulty with the South is that they're living 80 years behind the times, and the sooner they come out of it, the better it will be for the country and themselves." As we will explore in a future Whistle Stop and our upcoming To Secure These Rights series, Truman would go on to desegregate the military and federal workforce. While history informed Truman about our great republic, he was also steeped in knowledge of the challenges to our democracy. On June 16, 1949, he told reporters inquiring about the Red Scare, "Read your history through Jefferson's administration. Hysteria finally died down and the country didn't go to hell, and it isn't going to now." Truman was not ambivalent about communism and its threat to democracy. He looked at Plutarch's Lives, remember, given to him by his father, to assess the situation. It was the same with those old birds in Greece and Rome as it is now. The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. Now, speaking of things we know, how do we know that Truman read the Bible, presumably the family Bible, seen here, twice before the age of 12? Well, because he said so. Once writing, "I owe a great deal of familiarity with the Bible to my Masonic studies and to the fact that I read it through twice before I was 12 years old." After joining the Grandview, Missouri Masonic Lodge, Truman eventually became a 33-degree Mason, the highest order attained by a U.S. president. Truman's Masonic badge, pin, and rings, including his 33rd-degree ring, which he wore throughout the presidency, are on exhibit in the Plow to Politics Gallery, as well as a Bible that was given to him in honor of his service as a Mason. Now, in the Bible, Truman found the moral code core of American government, which he described in a 1952 address. And I'm sure you're tired of hearing me quote President Truman, so we're going to let him tell you himself.
The fundamental basis of this nation's ideals was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. The fundamental basis of the Bill of Rights of our Constitution comes from the teachings we get from Exodus, St. Matthew, Isaiah, and St. Paul. The Sermon on the Mount gives us a way of life. Maybe someday man will understand it as the real way of life. The basis of all great moral codes is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Some of you may think that such a philosophy as that has no place in politics or government, but it is the only philosophy on which you can base a lasting government. Governments built on that philosophy are built on a rock and will not fail.
One of Truman's favorite Psalms was Psalm 137. "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion." This, along with his Baptist upbringing and self-administered history education, informed Truman's support of a Jewish state. It is also believed that the Bible story of Cyrus, who freed Jews captive in Babylonia and allowed them to return home, influenced Truman's views on the establishment of a Jewish homeland. The idea of a Jewish return to Zion resonated with the president, even though many in the political military establishment strongly opposed the idea. On May 14, 1948, Truman declared de facto recognition of the provisional government of the State of Israel, which is a fascinating story that we'll explore at another Whistle Stop. Now, remember Cincinnatus and Washington from earlier in Truman's reading of Great Men and Famous Women? Well, Cincinnatus, the Roman military leader, was famous for holding power no longer than necessary. Like George Washington, Truman admired the men's ability to know how and when to lay down their great power. Truman had both in mind when he wrote an April 6, 1950 memoranda stating that he would not run for a third term in 1952. You can read both of them on these 2 pages, but I will also read it for you. In my opinion, 8 years as president is enough, and sometimes too much for any man to serve in that capacity. There is a lure in power. It can get caught in a man's blood, just as gambling and lust for money have been known to do. This is a republic, the greatest in the history of the world. I want this country to continue as a republic. Cincinnatus and Washington pointed the way. When Rome forgot Cincinnatus, its downfall began. When we forget the examples of such men as Washington, Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson, all of whom could have had a continuation in office, then we will start down the road to dictatorship and ruin. Both men also inspired Truman to embrace private life after the presidency. Seen here, you got it, reading with Bess in their home on Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. When asked by an editor of his memoirs if he liked to read himself to sleep at night, Truman answered, "No, young man, I like to read myself awake." Interested in following in Truman's bibliophile footsteps? Here's a list to get you started. Plutarch's Lives, Caesar's Commentaries, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Bunker Bean, Missouri's Struggle for Statehood, Plato's Republic, The Complete Works of Robert Burns, The Complete Works of Lord Byron, Edward Shepherd Creasy's 15 Decisive Battles of the World, Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, and William Shakespeare, all of his writings. Overwhelmed yet? Then a little piece of advice from the president. It's been a lifelong program for me, and if you start out, even on this incomplete list, you will find it a lengthy study, but well worthwhile. It will keep you out of mischief too. Now, as we approach the station, I'm going to hand over the controls to David McCullough to give the final thoughts on Truman's formative love for literature, as told to an audience in front of the Truman Library in honor of the library's 50th anniversary in 2007.
Ethel Noland, who was Harry Truman's cousin, wrote some very perceptive things about Truman. She said, among other things, "I don't know anybody in the world who ever read as much or as constantly as he did. He was what you would call a bookworm. History became a passion as he worked his way through a shelf of standard works on ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. He had a real feeling for history," she wrote, "that it wasn't something in a book, that it was part of life, a section of life, or a former time, that it was of interest because it had to do with people." Harry Truman understood that history is human. He understood that history isn't simple, that the history of our country isn't simple, America isn't simple. He understood that in a way, there's no such thing as the past. Nothing ever happened in the past. It only happened in the present, somebody else's present, not ours. John Adams, George Washington, Harry Truman, they didn't walk around saying, "Isn't this fascinating, living in the past? Aren't we remarkable in our funny clothes?" Truman understood the English language. Look at the famous speeches of the 1948 campaign, almost all delivered extemporaneously from the back of the train. Look at the quality of the language, the good, clear English language. How proud his teachers must have been. If a one-syllable word would suffice for a three-syllable word, you could count on Harry Truman to use the short word, just as Abraham Lincoln did. And it had much to do with the fact that he'd had Latin. He'd had a classical education, which is exactly the kind of education John Adams had, or Thomas Jefferson. And if you were George Washington or Henry Knox or the General Nathaniel Greene, and you'd only had a sixth grade education, then you read the classics in English translations. The classical education was what they understood history to mean in the founding time. There was no American history to read, so they read classical history. And from classical history came their notions of honor, virtue, honesty, character. Character is destiny, the Greeks said. And if you want to study that in a living model, look at the story of Harry Truman. Common sense. Common sense isn't common, as Voltaire observed, and who knows how many before Voltaire. Truman understood that, the enormous value, bedrock value of common sense.
Truman's first real test of his common sense, character, and leadership is the subject of our next stop, Captain Harry in World War I. On October 14th, find out what happened after Truman wrote home to Bess, "I wouldn't be left out of the greatest history-making epic the world has ever seen for all there is to live for." You can find information about future installments of this series, as well as other interesting programs, by signing up for our email newsletter at trumanlibraryinstitute.org and following the Truman Library Institute on Facebook. Speaking of interesting programs, join us Thursday at 6 p.m. Central for Third Reich on Trial, the Nuremberg trials, what happened and why it matters today. October marks the 75th anniversary of the conclusion of one of the most significant events in legal history. From November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, leading members of the Nazi Party had to answer to an international court for conspiracy, war crimes, and crimes against peace and humanity. On September 30th and October 1st, 1946, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, 7 were sentenced to prison, and 3 were found not guilty. To mark the 75th anniversary of the conclusion of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, our expert panel explores the remaining questions. Was justice served? And what is the legacy of the Nuremberg trials? If you haven't already, you can sign up for Thursday night's event at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. For now, we have arrived back at the station and it's time to disembark, but we look forward to having you aboard again soon. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.